Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first Nasco Education book chat. I am extremely excited for so many reasons, but before I tell you all that, let's just start with this is absolutely participation. I'm just going to say full contact sport, right? Yes, it's virtual, but let's just have some fun with it. So please, when you have a question, type it into the questions, and Jenny and I will make sure to monitor that. Today with me is Jenny Calvitis. She is also a customer engagement manager for career readiness. I am Chris Bakke. I am customer engagement for art. And that is part of the reason why we have this book, Growing Up Ugly, Memoirs of a Black Boy Daydreaming. And our extremely exciting guest is James Haywood Rolling Jr. And he is the president of NAEA. He's also an accomplished artist and a teacher and clearly a storyteller. He's the professor of art education at Syracuse University. And I am so blessed to have you here, James. And I don't want to take too much time to do any more introducing or talking about the book. I'll tell you that the minute I opened it and it said, this book is dedicated to anyone searching for their creative superpower, I was hooked. I was just like, this is going to be so awesome. So I'm going to have you start, please, and just tell us a little bit about how it began and why you decided to write it.
Well, first, I want to thank you, Chris and Jenny, and all of you over there at Nasco Education for inviting me and for arranging this this format for a conversation. I'll start by saying just a little bit of a run up to where I am now. Yes, I'm the chair of arts education at Syracuse University, but long before all of that, I was an elementary school art teacher in New York City, where I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And prior to all of that, I guess I would say I just considered myself an artist. I grew up in a household that had an art studio in the middle of it, which is an unusual upbringing because my father was a professional artist and raised a family of 6, 4 children. I was the oldest of 4 as a professional artist, and which was very unusual for an African-American man in that era. But how did the book come about? So I am a, I'm going to say three convergence of 3 origins, points of origin. First, most directly, I was soon after I became a faculty member at Syracuse University, I found a local church, and we were doing a vacation Bible school. At the time, I was noticing and remarking that the neighborhood that where we were working in was an outdoor event, ministry event, reminded me of the borough of Brooklyn and where I grew up for a lot of different reasons. And the children reminded me of kids that I grew up with. And the founder of the church that I was a part of at the time, and I was there because I was doing not only helping out, but I was doing street portraits, not caricatures. but actually portraits, which is a little bit different. He was suggesting to me that I should think about. He was somewhat familiar with my story and some of the wounds I had grown up with, and he suggested that the young people in Syracuse or young people elsewhere would benefit by hearing my story, and it stuck with me. Now that was over 10 years ago. I started writing then. I do a lot of writing. I've been writing since I was a teenager. This particular book, it took me a while to find the pathway, and I personally feel like 10 years was too long, but it finally got birthed on my birthday, December 28th last year, and so that's a part of it. The other 2 pieces I'll say to round that out is that if I look back in my old prayer journal, um, it reminds me that one of the things that has motivated me for a very, very long time in my life has been ministering to broken lambs, as I call them. I used to actually work as the art director for a camp at my church in Brooklyn, the Brooklyn Tabernacle. I used to work as the art director for a camp ministering to kids who were abused, severely abused, and in the foster care system. And I did it for 10 years. And it's the same motivation. And which is driven by the title, which we'll get into in just a bit. The last bit is that I graduated from the School of Art Leaders, the National Education Association School for Art Leaders in 2018. And a real big premise of that leadership development experience is storytelling. And it amplified and affirmed my sense at the time that is to tell stories in this, tell stories that will reach an audience that needs it, that needs to hear what you just noted in the dedication, that it's for anyone who's looking to discover their own creative superpower. And so that's what brought the book into being.
That is fabulous, and I love it so much. And I'm sorry, Jenny, I know I'm like, she gets to start with the questions, but I'm so excited. That was fantastic. Thank you.
That really was. I love kind of how you came at this audience. So I wanted to ask specifically, when you were writing this, then were you targeting, thinking about those youths who might need that message?
Yes, whenever you're writing anything, you have to think about the audience in mind ahead of time. And I knew that I wanted to reach young adults, and that to me is, and it, as a matter of fact, because I wasn't targeting like this particular age, that particular age, just young adults. There could be anyone who could read, frankly, anyone who could read the book. I try to keep the language such that it wasn't that it was above elementary school, but not dense. Something that could draw young adults into the story. And then also understanding that adults are in the same situation, same sense of oftentimes not fully understanding their creative powers, their creative agency. Obviously, I was also looking to speak to adults too, largely because in speaking to one slice of the audience which would be art teachers and educators, oftentimes they would be the ones who would help identify, okay, you need to read this book, young man, young lady, right? So that would help find its audience. So also parents who are working with children or young people that need to hear the story of really inspiration. It's a playful title, a meaningful title, in that it starts with the notion of ugliness, but it's meant to move to the notion of daydreams, and that's very intentional.
I really like that a lot, especially because I think like you said, I think that's a perfect way to describe it in terms of it's a story of inspiration. And it's because there's so many there's a whole lot you could talk about in regards to, I know that especially in the past for 2020, lots of teachers wondered how they could talk about anti-racism and how they could do it in a safe manner. And honestly, while this book I didn't feel like it had a gigantic anti-racist agenda, it clearly shared some stories about how there was racism in there. And it, for me, it was a moment where I just felt like I can't possibly understand that. I have never, ever had that happen to me. And I can't imagine that feeling. And it was such a nice eye opener to have somebody share that story and have you feel that feeling. And I
Yes.
thought it would be a really great thing for, and it was, like I said, it was so easy to read that I felt like, boy, this would be great for junior high and high school.
Yeah, yeah. I'll say, just I know there wasn't a question attached to that, but I'll just say that the notion of talking about, well, it's one of the reasons why we tell stories, right? So in order to be able to convey lived experiences that others have not shared, and in so doing, sharing them so that others can comprehend and maybe even get inside of it a little bit, right? Or maybe vice versa, that the story would infiltrate into their thinking or into their mindset about others in the nation. And so there's two things I was attempting to do in terms of, in terms of getting at those stories. Yes, if you read the book, you recognize that when I speak of growing up ugly, it's drawing from lived experiences in my own home and family, but not just that. It's also the fact that I was very precocious, and I understood very, very, very early on that there was something of being a misfit about my life, and that was exacerbated by the fact that I was bused from a largely a majority minority neighborhood, African Americans, West Indians, Puerto Ricans, to Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, which near Coney Island, which was the opposite, and that was a part of the city's effort and a part of the national effort to try to desegregate schooling, to cause integration to take place. But there were repercussions to that. One of that is that sense as one of a handful of Black kids in an all-white school, wherein there was definitely a sense that I wasn't quite, always welcomed, and there was definitely a sense of being a misfit. But you get a sense that along with that sense of being a misfit, and I noticed in media, faces like mine weren't prevalent, right? And it became clearer as I grew up that in the storytelling of the United States, African Americans historically have often been portrayed as monstrosities, as misfits, as not belonging, as dangerous, and all these things. And I absorbed this, internalized it, and it came out as a sense of ugliness, right? But I also wanted to get a sense of, give a sense of whatever stereotypes there exist about what goes on in the mind and the heart and the thinking of a young Black boy. I wanted to explode that a bit by opening up a light on terms of what my thought life was actually like, right? What my aspirations were actually like. And so that I was filled with the creativity that often manifests itself as daydreaming, where you're listening, but you also, that prompts other thinking that takes place, and people think you're not paying attention, but you actually are, and it takes you outside, and then you get chastised for that. And so, but that daydreaming continued to fuel me to the point that I became someone who was very keen on looking at and noticing the same in others that looked like me and were also overlooked or underestimated in terms of what their thought life and what their aspirations were. And so once again, moving from that place of ugliness or growing up ugly to a place where one recognizes that agency makes your life matter, right? So I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And we did have our first question come in from a person who's tuning in live. So if you have questions, it's a great time to write some in. But Damika said, I like the fact that you address the teacher community, not to, and I quote, treat like a peripheral concern students of color, not to punish daydreaming students during outside lunch breaks.
Yes. Yeah, it is addressed very much to the teacher community, and I speak in the book about the fact that I didn't necessarily plan on becoming a teacher. That was not my first inspiration. My first inspiration was to was to be an artist, to be a creator. But it was at some point, when I was studying at the Cooper Union in New York City as an undergrad student. I started teaching in a Saturday program, which was a portfolio prep program for teenagers. And I was obviously rather young. I started college young as it was, at 16 years old. So I wasn't too much of an age difference between me and the kids I was teaching. But that's where I first got struck by the notion that, oh, it's just as important for me to be a catalyst for other people's creativity as it is to stoke my own, right? So ultimately, and it never stayed. Even when I went on to Syracuse University, did my MFA there, I came back to New York City and started teaching in elementary schools and worked my way up through the ranks. And so I still believe that, and this is why I'm a teacher educator today. I train new art teachers to go out into the world. It's because I think of art teachers as creativity teachers. I've always thought that. I've always thought about the interdisciplinary aspect of teaching creativity. Oftentimes taught writing and social studies in the middle of my art lessons because it makes sense. It's all connected. It's about these ways of shaping our ideas, as shaping our identity. So yes, I do speak to teachers as well because they have a crucial role in terms of being a catalyst for the next generation of creatives.
We have another question, and in terms of teachers, I swear I call myself an art teacher's biggest fan. Bob writes in, James, you said you've always been a writer. What was the catalyst / inspiration for you becoming a writer? And how or where does writing and making art coalesce for you?
Okay, these are great questions. Thanks, Bob. So writing started for me in high school. I actually started off writing poetry, and poetry is one of those efforts to crystallize your thinking down to the most essential words. You know, you keep on going back and tinkering and pulling out words and pulling out sentences and fixing phrases. And to me, it's you workshop sentences. And even in the book Growing Up Ugly, every sentence is workshop. Every sentence, there's no word in there that doesn't exist there because I didn't carefully think, is this the right word, or is there a better way of saying this? That's another way of saying that I've always considered writing one of my creative practices. I obviously am a visual artist. Experimental studios was what my major was when I did my MFA, which means mixed media essentially. And I spent half my time in the library because I was a fellow in African American Studies at the time as well. I've always been multiple in terms of my thinking and my avenues. I sing. The thing I don't do well at all is dance, so don't ask me. But the point though is that there is a connectivity between all creative practices. And for me to go to the last part of that question, you know, I chafe at the idea that and I push back hard at the idea that the purpose of the arts is to express yourself, and that's it. It's a very narrow view because through the arts, we shape identity, we make cross-cultural boundary crossings, we are able to take our ideas and other people's ideas and to turn them into models and then cast them back into the public discourse, looking at them either in the form of a painting or a sculpture or a performance or a digital piece, and then using that to adapt and then take from that and pull gifts from it. So ultimately, I'll circle back around. When I first started writing, I oftentimes wrote because I saw a need. I was very internal, very quiet, but I was always very, very, very observant. And when I saw someone who was struggling, who wasn't quite, you know, you can tell emotionally that they were in some abyss, I would oftentimes write a poem or a creative work of art just to give away as a gift. I've always thought that, and I still understand that the arts are a way of giving gifts to one another, to one another's cultures, to the next generations of the best of ourselves. because of the effort to refine these things. And I see the same, I see a comparable effort in terms of refining a visual work of art and a piece of writing. That revision process is very, very important to me in both. And that's how I connect the two.
So one of the things that you said a couple times throughout the book is that your true superpower is creating something out of nothing. So wondering a little bit more about how that helps you connect with especially students and youth with this idea of equity and creating something when you don't necessarily have all of the same equitable means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm very heavily involved with creating greater equity in terms of access into the arts practices through the National Education Association and my role there. And I'll make this connection because it goes back to this notion of agency again. Making art is not it's not a magic trick. It's not like presto, you've got the ability to do it and other people have to watch you because you're the one on stage. It's not like a conjuring. It's not a rabbit out of the hat. It's a practice, and I tend to have lots of pop culture references. I'll limit them here, but because I glean so much from stories, I glean them from everything from science fiction to comics to silent movies to whatever. I just enjoy stories in whatever form I find them. And so there's this old Star Trek episode, the original, where James T. Kirk is facing the captain of a race that looked like reptiles. They're called Gorns, and he's definitely outmatched. It's a contest for survival. He's outmatched, and what he does is that all of a sudden, instead of throwing in the towel, he takes a second look at the landscape, a very barren landscape where he's at, and he discovers, wait a minute, there are chemicals here. He realizes he can put that together and then that together, and then make gunpowder, and oh, those are diamonds. Those can be used as projectiles for a handmade cannon. I'm thinking of in another total other notion. There's this character in a movie called The Great Escape from the 1960s, and this James Garner's character named Henley, who was known as someone who was able to scrounge out things that should not have been possible to find, but oftentimes he would take things that would be necessary or being used for one thing and repurpose them and retrofit them and to adapt them in order to help them the prisoners that he was with to make that great escape. And so what I'm getting at all of that is that one of the things that's often overlooked in terms of the way we see some and the way we overlook others is gets overcome when we take that second and that third look. And more importantly, it's in the individual, the ability to sort of take a second and third look at themselves and realize that what has been said about them or what has been suggested in terms of what their limits are can be retrofitted, can be revised. You can always take a story and change the ending, right? Like a script. You don't have to fall in line with the pre-scripted notion of who you're supposed to be, what your destiny is supposed to be. You can recreate your destination. You can be Harold with his purple crayon and create a portal out of nowhere, right? So when you understand that agency is available to all, you realize that oftentimes you just need to help folks have access to opportunities to learn that agency, to exercise that agency. And that's why it's so important for me to see young people given access to creative activities, because I've oftentimes seen kids who everyone else swore was not creative. You put them in a group with other kids who are creating, and it all comes out, right? You just need to have even with sometimes trepidation, but once you're in the mix and everyone's making things and teaching one another how to make things, the latent abilities come out.
That is fantastic. We have lots of people asking questions. It says, hey, James, Lynn Felt's here. I love Lynn. What is one of your most important stories?
Hi, Lynn. I love Lynn too. So what's one of my, I would say, to answer the question, one of the more formative stories I've ever told is in the book. And I've actually titled it in other places, just pull it out by itself. It's called Skin, and it's about an experience I had at the Museum of Modern Art as a young art student, going to see a lithography exhibit on off hours when it was closed. And the short of it is that I was just another member of the class walking in the museum, dressed down with jeans and sneakers, just like all the other kids in the class. But twice, both at the entrance to the museum and then up on the upper floor at the entrance to the actual lithographs, the prints, I was stopped. I was pulled aside to ask the same question each time. May I help you? And it caused me to took me back each time. I never really thought about what I looked like as a young college student. I was a first generation college student. Never thought what it must have looked like to see me in that group in the early 80s. But it became clear to me very quickly that, oh, it's because I'm the only Black kid in the group. And I was the only one. I was often always the only one since I was in elementary school, as I mentioned, So, and it struck me, it hit me. It's that, so just by even me just simply walking up, I was on a full scholarship. I wasn't a slacker. And yet I was assumed to be a messenger for no other reason except for my skin color. Right. And it struck me that I could never escape my skin. This would be, and so this was an important story because it allowed me to begin to recognize, okay, this is going to be a lifelong thing. This is, it's not anything that my effort, my intellect could change, because it was a gut reaction, the first assumption. So whatever the case, that to me was a very important story because it helped me to become an activist at my undergraduate school, and I've always been one since then, for the sake of helping spare others from that sense of being put in boxes before you even walk into a room.
Absolutely. We have more questions too as well.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we have somebody who's even referencing the pages. So page 64, and then again on page 89, the comparison between the caged Black Panther and your own situation.
Hmm. So
your thoughts on it.
Just a comment on it. So thanks for the question. I would say that two things. One is I love cats. I love cats, big and small. They're beautiful creatures. They remind me of myself in the sense of their ability to move along silently and to be just the way their presence in the world. I enjoy everything about them. So I remember once at the Central Park Zoo, before they renovated it. It was a harsh place, lots of steel and concrete. Before now everybody, they do these sort of animal-like habitats that didn't used to be the case. So I once remember going to visit Central Park Zoo, and I stood there for like, well, over a half hour watching a Black Panther pace back and forth in a space that wasn't much longer than his body from nose to tail. There was not room to do anything more than to pace and then spin around and pace and spin around and pace and spin around and pace. And it was almost like it wasn't thinking anymore. It was, for me, it felt like the cat had been driven insane because it was trapped. And it struck me that I saw myself in there because I felt, trapped and confined in terms of my upbringing. That's another story. Certainly felt trapped by other people's stereotypes of who I was. Also, there was a spiritual element to it, and that I felt trapped in terms of my sense of being so distant from others and so cut off that I didn't know how to connect. In the same way that cat was stuck in that cage and could not connect and could not be a cat, right? So the short of it is that it became an important metaphor in the book in one particular chapter in terms of expressing how I had purpose to sort of free myself and find a path out of those kinds of traps.
Very good.
So another question that came in is, you provide your audience with excellent lessons on how to develop difference into an advantage, on how to acknowledge teachers' credo, and how to make something from nothing, and all in class and extracurricular activities. Thank you for the pleasure of reading your memoir and sharing your life's worth of experiences.
Oh, that sounds this is not like a question. It sounds like a thank you.
No, I think it's just kudos.
It's just somebody just, and I will
appreciate
second that emotion.
Yeah, thank you.
Was there, you talked about your neighborhood and you talked about even like doing art, and you talk about architecture. Do you think that there's this amazing portrait on the front of this book, which is illustrated by you?
Yes.
Do you think there's a connection between architecture and portrait drawing?
Yeah, very much so. As a matter of fact, especially the way I practiced it. So I'll say, as a quick bit of context, my first college major was architecture. As a matter of fact, when I was in high school, I went to the High School of Art and Design. You have a chance to select your major in your last two, in your junior and senior year, and I chose architecture for interesting reasons. But I think that I was always attracted to the idea of constructing and building, and because that was a making process that was very hands-on, and I connected with that. I think that when you are doing a portrait, and I handle it the same way, a portrait is a construction. It's a representation of somebody's life, a lived moment, a moment that was experienced, and you're attempting to sort of mark that experience by reconstructing it. And so there's an assembly process. Like when I used to be very meticulous. I would make my portraits out of color pencil, and if you looked at some of mine, you might see a skin color that somebody might say, oh, he has brown skin. Well, I would construct my skin out of 14 different colors, layered on top of each other, and then fixative, and another layer, and then fixative, and then another layer. So I would very much assemble or construct these portraits. And there was a time when I was doing mixed media studies that I actually made three-dimensional portraits, where I would make it out of soil and clay and craft it and build it up, and then add color on top of it. Very, very time-consuming, because I was very, very invested in this notion of assembly and construction. And so for me, the idea that there's more than just what's on the surface, that there's an underground, or that there's a subterranean notion to what you're putting onto a canvas or onto a piece of museum board, that has always been a part of me. And I'll say as anecdote, that in the interim between being an architecture major and a fine arts major focusing on drawing and printmaking, I actually had a profession as a freelance architectural model maker for architectural firms in New York City. And I did it for about a year and a half while I was making the transition, trying to figure out who I was. But even there, there's a craft to it that I appreciate in terms of connection. And so I hope that answers the question.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
So another question is, with your target audience of working with youth and hopefully helping change youth's lives, do you have any supplemental materials that teachers can look at for like a nonfiction unit in English language arts?
Well, okay. So that's an interesting question because you're getting at what the ripple effect is of having put this book out there. I'm still collecting ideas about what I do with this book. I have in the past done participated in edited volumes where we were asked to create sort of like extensions for the discussion that was in the article. This is a part of the role of being a scholar, which is that you take the ideas and best practices and stories of researched circumstances and situations, and you put them out there for other people to then take them and adapt them and make them their own. And so I have been a part of volumes like that, but I've not done anything yet with this volume, which is my own volume, right? I am right now at a local high school doing a project with the art teacher in that high school, where I was doing some virtual push-ins. It's been hard for art teachers to flesh out the curriculum and during the pandemic in a very remote, in terms of all the remote learning. And so I volunteered just to connect with some kids about this idea at this local high school, about this idea of finding your own creative superpower. And once we had a first virtual visit, it turned into, well, the kids were interested in the fact that I both drew and wrote. And there was an interest in the English teacher there for me to do some prompts for kids to, which I developed, I wrote out for me to come back and visit and prompt them to create either works of art or works of writing or combinations of both. So that's an ongoing project, which sort of grew a bit out of the book very organically. But maybe gets at what this question or the person who wrote the question is getting at, that there is a life for this book in terms of creating both visual and written prompts. And I can definitely see that because, like I said, I'm doing it right now at this particular local high school.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Also, you mentioned volunteering a lot. Do you think that, like what prompts you in terms of volunteering, and speak a little bit towards that? It seems like it's a big part of who you are.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. On reflection, it is. I spent a lot of time in my life doing projects and working with camps and things like that that's volunteer work. As a matter of fact, you could make the argument that everything that I do with the National Education Association is volunteer work. And I really respect the fact that I have colleagues who are willing, just as willing as I am, to invest in the field and best practices and helping once again shape the next generation of art teachers and arts learners. So it goes back for me to the notion that when I first recognized that it was important for me to be a catalyst for other people's creativity, for the creativity in others, I recognized that it was because my lived experiences as a creator, as someone who was invested in making, not everyone shares that. Obviously, we live in a world where it's undervalued, where we oftentimes feel like we're in a fight to have funding kept for these essential practices, which have actually created, created civilizations, right? Making in all forms, design, architecture, performance, storytelling through various mediums. Communicating ideas and identities through various mediums. So the point is that who better to pass the baton along to someone else who is finding their way, who hasn't found their way yet, who's still learning to discover what their superpowers are, because the creative agency, like I say, builds cultures, especially in collaboration with one another, builds civilizations. So these are tremendous powers, and oftentimes our schooling situations dulls and diminishes students' own relationship with their own creative capacities. So it's essential for us to, as much as possible, mentor, and sometimes it's professional teaching, and sometimes it's off the cuff kind of, whatever I can do to help pass the baton along and help folks recognize the latent ability that's, and capacity that they have. What better thing to do? Frankly, it's the nature of the arts. As I said before, it's a prompt. Whenever you go to see a painting or a sculpture or a work of architecture that elevates you and wants you to take your energies, elevates you and prompts you to take your energies and to apply them to making something as best as possible in whatever medium. These things can speak across generations, across eras, across geographies, across languages, right? The things that prompt you to want to make and engage and shape, right? So we can do it in a hands-on way with the youngsters too, and we need to, because there's too much in our society that either distracts or diminishes, or in many cases, in terms of the racial biases that we see and ethnic biases that we see, even being played out in this most recent massacre in Atlanta. These are things which kill the soul. And so let's all be about finding ways to revive, help us to, it's about resilience. Ultimately, it helps us to find our way back to our shape as human beings, right? So this is just my own thinking about it, and hopefully it's useful to someone else.
That's great. We did have another question that came in from Stephanie, and she asked, can we just have a short synopsis in your mind about what it truly means to find your creative superpower?
So I guess the best way of saying that would be, I'll take you back to my father's art studio to tell you in the form of a story. So my father used to collect comics, and I discovered them very early on in terms of his art studio. He kept them in his art studio. He also kept a lot of other reference material there because, like I said, he had his drafting table, all of his supplies, his markers, and his pads, and whatever the case. And it was a place for experimenting. Whenever I could sneak in without him knowing I was there, because it was like his space, and so I had to sometimes sort of like sneak in and make sure everything was left exactly where it was. But the point is that I early on made a connection between some of the characters I found in my father's comics, and eventually I became a comics collector myself, and those latent abilities. A very great analogy is the X-Men. People have heard of that as a Marvel Comics characters who were oftentimes ostracized and belittled, and there was like the experience bias because they were different. They were mutants, and that was not by accident. That was the authors are trying to get at this notion of difference and how how it gets treated. But at the same time, you immediately recognize, but they had awesome superpowers though. At the same time, they had origin stories, which oftentimes, and this is something I'll get to help to round up this synopsis. In literally every comic movie, right? I know some people love them, some people hate them, but there's something analogous in there that's worth noticing, which is that there's this origin that when the superhero something changed. I hope folks can still hear me. When the superhero finds his or her superpower, they're spending a little time.
We can still hear you.
Okay, I'm share my webcam. I don't know what happened. Can you see me? Hopefully you can still see me.
Oh,
Okay.
now we can.
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah, something dropped out there. But I was going to say that there's this moment where someone who's just discovered their latent powers has to figure out, okay, I can lift this much. I can make myself invisible. I can, I didn't know that. Oh, wow. Look at the movie Shazam, right? And the point is that, to me, there's an analogy where there's an exercise, there's a practice. You have to test it out. You have to experiment with what you can do. And I oftentimes feel like what we do in the art studio is a place where we do these kinds of experiments. Oh, I can do this when I do this. Happens when I do that. And so, but the point is that is to figure out the latent abilities, the latent agency, the things that you haven't exercised, and then explore it and then use it. Because that's ultimately what a superhero does. Someone who discovers a great superpower, they make use of it, they practice it, they put it into they use it to intervene and where the needs are at, right? And that's something, and also an analogy that I think is worth noticing or making note of when I talk about the whole idea of finding ones to create a superpower. With great
I love that.
power, with great power comes great responsibility, Spider-Man once said.
Yes, absolutely. More questions?
No, I think that we've wrapped up there.
If you have, we have plenty of time. So if you have questions, we don't want to take our questions over yours. So, but I did want to say, boy, you touched on something that was 100% true for me. It happened to fall under both volunteering and the whole idea of being inspired. Every time I've ever volunteered to be at Youth Art Month and to present any of those kinds of things, I've always been so inspired by the art in the exhibit. And it reminded me that it was always in March. And interestingly enough, in my family, I had a son who played basketball and was lucky enough to go to the state championship. And I remember that I was excited for that, but I didn't want to go home and play basketball after that. When I went to Youth Art Month, I wanted to go home and create something. I wanted to try something, I mean, there were like first graders where I'm like, I don't even know if I can do that, but that is gorgeous and I would love to try that. So I love how that you spoke about that. That was it just brought up that feeling inside of me that was just, and at NAEA, when you see, the Youth Art Month exhibit and it's everybody's stuff, it is so worth celebrating. Jenny, more questions from you or on the thing? I don't want to be the one taking over the stage here.
Not on the thing, but I think maybe if we wanted to work through that breathing exercise we wanted to do. Do we want to do that now?
Sure. Yes, I think that gives us plenty of time. We loved that on page 174, you sort of worked through an exercise of breathing that you suggest. Tell us a little bit about it and then take us through it before we close. That gives you plenty of time and we don't have to rush you.
Oh, sure. And I thank you for noting that, and that it seems to speak to folks. So as you read through the book, breathing is something that I keep on coming back to in the book, partly because I grew up with asthma, partly because of a period where I was suffering from after my father died suddenly, where I was suffering from anxiety attacks. Where I finally learned that a big major way out of you lose control of your breathing, and you don't even recognize that you've lost control of your breathing. At this point in my life, I actually take yoga classes where there's a big focus on breath. And so when I was writing that passage at near the end of the book, I was thinking about the breath, and I was thinking about a rhythm to the notion of making. And I wasn't necessarily thinking about doing what you're asking me to do here in terms of like teaching, sort of like taking folks through it. But for me to go through it, I'm going to read the passage that leads right into that exercise, because it was a thought exercise about developing agency, which is oftentimes what you're doing in the moment when you're practicing your breathing. You're, out of your breathing, your life is invested in each breath, right? It's and we oftentimes are not thinking about our breath going through the day. So let me just read this. This comes once again in the last chapter, in the epilogue, I believe. So what story will you tell? Collect the building blocks of your story from the carpet of your memory. Write each word of your new chapter with purpose. Raise up each wall. There is a reason why your story feels different from everyone else's. You can tell it. Rap it, write it, sing it, all of the above. But it's yours to communicate like no one else can. For those who are young, I can tell you that life will get better. For those who are older, I'm happy to report that life goes on, even when you think it's too late and you've taken an unplanned turn and feel totally lost. Take a step forward right now, and you'll suddenly have momentum and new direction no matter how long you've stood still. If you're smart, don't play dumb. If you care deeply, don't waste time pretending that you don't. If you like to read, feed on as many books as you please. And if you need to wear glasses to sharpen your vision, take time to fix your eyes on the people and the principles that others choose to overlook. Study those things. If you want to live an outstanding life, the easiest way to stand out is by getting out of your own way first. Never settle for less when you're making something valuable from scratch. Now, feel free. Take a deep breath. Breathe in. Live an important life. Breathe out. Imagine the best. Breathe in. Bend boundary lines and erase old borders. Breathe out. Give your art away. Breathe in. Defy other people's low expectations. Breathe out. Rise to meet someone else's need. And that was it.
That so moved me when I read it, though. I just was like, oh, thank you for writing that. Like and just to tell you the truth, boy, I hope you've audio done this book, because your voice is beautiful to listen to as well.
It's funny. I thank you for mentioning that, Chris, because actually someone suggested that I should do it, to do an audiobook. I hadn't thought of it at first. It's available in print and as an ebook, but someone suggested that, there's some folks with maybe with vision problems or maybe on a drive might want to hear it. And you're not the first person. Maybe there's a benefit to having been a singer for so much of my life. Maybe it's not something with vocal cords that that might make us find a new audience.
I also want to echo that I think it'd be wonderful if you do an audiobook, also because of reading levels and making this book more accessible to some students who might not need to hear your story, but might have a lot of difficulty actually following the story through the written word. So when you pair the two together, it becomes a powerful tool.
Thank you for that. I very, very much appreciate those suggestions, Jenny.
We do have somebody asking a question, and we don't want to omit anybody's. Do you ask students to list things that they do well in order to open their minds to the superpower dialogue and the personal search for their own power?
That's a very deep question. In terms of, I'm assuming they're talking about listing what. Let's put it this way. I have asked students to note the things that they invest themselves in doing when no one asked them to. The things that they find themselves doing, they can imagine themselves doing even if no one paid them, as a way of finding and accessing. And I think I talk about it in that last chapter as well, as a way of sort of locating what it is that they are wired to do, what it is that they're and they have an affinity for. And I imagine that what the person who wrote the question is getting at is that there's that might be a way of helping students sort of mine themselves, so to speak. So I think it's a great idea.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie, for the question. So I just want to wrap up that it's a gift to us that you wrote this book, because it is a fabulous opportunity to hear your story and somehow relate it to our own story. And for that, I thank you so much for the book and for sharing it with me and the world. Jenny?
I echo that completely. When Chris came to me with your book, I was excited to open it, read it, didn't entirely know what to expect with it, right? I am not a black boy in any sense of that term, as a white girl from Wisconsin. But just like Chris said, there were some amazing universals that you got down to that were so incredibly powerful, even though on those surface, the black boy wasn't my identity, but I found that so many of the concepts that you explored with your identity still spoke to me as well. And I think that transcending power is going to change so many youth's lives, and really impacted mine too. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And I'll say something real quickly about that, just in response. Let's turn it around. Anyone who is a minority in this nation, we watch TV shows all the time that have characters that don't look anything like us and haven't lived any experiences that are similar to ours. And yet we find ourselves in resonance in some of those characters, like a very well-known TV show, This Is Us. It really is us, right? And you can find yourself in anybody's story. It can be a prompt for your own storytelling. And so I just want to say that it's not surprising at all that you be able to find resonance and commonality when reading my story. It's what we do as human beings.
I think the irony is that in the end, you are somewhat of an architect. You clearly are constructing and building in relationships and in the work that you are doing, and it's exceptional, and we're so grateful for it. Thank you for being our first author. And for those of you who joined us today, thank you very much for joining us. If you have suggestions for other authors that we might invite on to book chat, or books that you would like us to investigate, in April, we are inviting an art educator, just happens to be another art educator, Sarah Krajewski, with the book Exactly You. It was right behind me. I thought I could get it into the screen, but I didn't. So please come back for that. James, thank you so very much.
And thank you, everyone who's watching, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, James.
Mm-hmm.